For our book club, we chose Brain-Friendly Strategies for the Inclusion Classroom by Judy Willis. And this book is mainly about how to include all of your students in your instruction in an inclusion classroom. So that means a variety of different learning abilities. The first big idea of this book was the emphasis on science. So this book uses science to back itself up continuously. There's also a heavy emphasis on gray matter. And gray matter is a major part of the nervous system. And it ties into a bunch of different learning abilities. So there is also an in-depth explanation of different scanning procedures. The first one is a PET scan. So this procedure is a three-dimensional image of functional processes in the body based on the detection of radiation from the emission of tiny particles emitted from a radioactive substance administered to the subject in combination with glucose. As the subject engages in various cognitive activities, the scan records the rate at which specific regions of the brain use the glucose. These recordings are used to produce maps of areas of high brain activity with particular cognitive functions. The next one is the fMRI, which measures the metabolic changes that take place in the active part of the brain. This technology behind the fMRI makes use of the fact that the oxygenated blood shows up better on MRI images than it does non-oxygenated blood. Because active regions of the brain receive more blood and more oxygen, scientists can use fMRI images to determine which areas of the brain demonstrate more activity. The next scanning procedure is the QEEG, which uses digital technology to measure electrical patterns at the surface of the scalp, which primarily reflect the cortical electrical activity of brain waves. This brainwave monitoring provides brain mapping data based on the precise localization and timing of brainwave patterns coming from the parts of the brain actively engaged in processing information. So the reason that this book has such a heavy influence on the science of the brain is because it is trying to inform the reader of why students do what they do. If teachers know the cause scientifically, then it would be easier for them to implement specific instruction that would most benefit the student. The next big idea is attention deficit or attention disorders. Attention disorders affect 2.6 million children ages 6 to 11. So this book looks at how to work with students who struggle with being able to focus. Willis suggests that the most effective way to begin to make progress with students is to show them and their families respect. An example that she provides in the book is a letter that she wrote home to a student named Cody. Cody was a student who had difficulty focusing and staying in the seat. However, she wrote a letter home describing all of the positive things that he was doing in class and identified what he was doing right. So when the parents received this letter, they obviously informed Cody, and Cody began to perform exceptionally in class, and his parents were able to also begin to focus on the positive aspects of Cody's abilities rather than just focusing on the negative. There are different levels of attention. So the first level is survival mode. Students should be beyond this mode when they enter school. However, students with attention disorders have difficulty with too much input. So depending on what they are going through, different stresses push them to their survival mode. So if a student is pushed too far, they will revert back to what they know will keep them safe. The next level is interest mode. So students in this mode pay attention to things that interest them. So as a teacher, it is important to know your students and know what interests them in order for them to be engaged in the activity and lesson that you are giving them. The third level is the highest level, which is selective mode. This is where we want all of our students to be. So students at this mode have reached the highest level of attention and can focus on the sensory input that they need to understand. So, excuse me, these students are able to use prior knowledge or outside sources to be able to retain the information that the teacher is giving them. The next big idea is multisensory. So multisensory is a teaching style that appeals to multiple facets of children's learning styles. A quote from the book, what is multisensory lessons that key into the students' learning strengths, help them to connect their sensory response systems and brain activity and storage centers to new learning. So by using multisensory lessons, students have more avenues of being able to retain the information that's given to them. So the different memory systems that can be stimulated are working memory, semantic memory, episodic memory, procedural memory, automatic memory, emotional memory, and relational memory. When multisensory learning is being used, 2 or more of these memory systems are being stimulated. So by stimulating more than one memory system with more than one type of sensory input increases the chances of creating long-term memory of the information. So the more ways that you are able to connect the information with the student, the more likely they are able to retain that information to long-term memory. So the goal is to stimulate at least 2 of these memory systems for the students to connect with the information. So a teaching strategy that I would like to use in my classroom would be multisensory. Multisensory learning allows for students to have multiple avenues for learning the material. It gives them a more objective way of learning and giving them hands-on and kinesthetic ways of learning. So when using multisensory lessons in the classroom, it will allow the students that have learning disabilities to benefit from the lesson that is being given. So they'll be able to access the material that maybe in other ways they wouldn't have been able to. When multisensory lessons are given, students are using multiple memory systems, which allow for greater opportunity of retaining the material, which I covered earlier. So how to implement this in the classroom? Lessons should link factual information to sensory input. This stimulates parallel memory systems. When stimulating these 2 memory systems simultaneously, memory retention is made through relational connections and personalization. An example of a multisensory lesson that I found would be for phonics for students who are learning how to spell. So students would have a collection of different little bags that have a picture of what could be a cat or dog, really anything, and also the letters that are cut into little squares to match whatever picture they are given. So the students would pull out the picture and lay out the letters, and the picture would be laid out, and then the student would have to use the letters to spell whatever picture is being displayed. So this would access multiple memory systems for the student to be able to retain the information that they are being given. So to identify the instructional variables for implementing this strategy, you just really need to know your students. So the more deeply that you know your students, you know what interests them, you're able to connect the material with them. So if you don't know your students well, then using multisensory as a learning strategy would be difficult and probably not completely effective for those students. So by being able to connect and relate and understand where your students are coming from and knowing what interests them and what gets their brains going and makes them excited to learn, multisensory learning would be best implemented in that way. So that's my presentation on brain-friendly strategies for the inclusion classroom by Judy Willis.